A few years ago, a group of friends and I decided to spend a weekend at a remote cabin deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, far from the noise of city life. We had rented the cabin through a website, and it looked charming in the photos, rustic, cozy, and perfect for a weekend retreat. We arrived late in the afternoon. The cabin was nestled among tall pines, with a small creek running nearby. It was exactly as advertised, an old, wooden structure with a stone fireplace and a large porch. After unpacking, we settled in and lit a fire, enjoying the serene surroundings. That night, as we sat around the fireplace telling stories and playing games, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, creating an eerie, whistling sound that seemed to resonate through the cabin. We joked about it, attributing the strange noises to the old building and the dense forest. Around midnight, we decided to head to bed. I was the last one up, so I made sure all the windows and doors were locked. I turned off the lights and went to my room, which was on the second floor. As I was getting into bed, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside the window. I dismissed it as a branch brushing against the glass and fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up to a crisp, sunny day. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed peaceful. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of nature. We returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, tired but happy. As dusk approached, we started preparing dinner. The wind picked up again, and the sound from the previous night returned, more pronounced this time. It was unsettling but not alarming, so we tried to ignore it and focused on our meal. After dinner, we decided to play a game of cards in the living room. The wind was stronger now, and the old windows rattled with each gust. It was then that I noticed something strange. The front door, which had been firmly shut when we arrived, was slightly ajar. I was certain that I had locked it before. I closed the door and checked the lock, but everything seemed secure. My friends shrugged it off, attributing it to the wind or a draft. We resumed our game, but the scratching noise outside grew louder and more persistent. As the night wore on, the scratching sound became almost rhythmic, like someone or something was deliberately scraping at the window. It was unnerving. We took turns checking outside, but there was nothing there. The forest was dark and silent, save for the howling wind. Around midnight, as we were preparing to go to bed, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the only source of light was the flickering glow of candles we had set up. We used the flashlight to check the fuse box, but everything seemed fine. The scratching sound was now accompanied by a soft, eerie whispering. It was as if someone was trying to communicate through the walls. We were all on edge, and the atmosphere in the cabin became tense. We decided to stay together in the living room, waiting for the power to come back on. The wind howled louder than ever, and the whispers seemed to intensify. We huddled close, trying to keep calm and rational. We told stories to distract ourselves, but the fear was palpable. Eventually, the power was restored, and the cabin lit up again. The scratching and whispering stopped abruptly, as if whatever had been there was suddenly gone. We checked the windows and doors once more, but everything was secure. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin early. None of us spoke much about the strange occurrences, but we were all relieved to be heading back to civilization. We never returned to that cabin, and to this day, we still talk about that night. The experience was unsettling, but we were all safe. We never did find out what caused the strange noises or the mysterious door. The cabin remains a place of eerie memories, a reminder that sometimes, the unknown is more terrifying than anything we can understand. I never believed in the paranormal. That was until last winter when my friends and I rented a remote cabin deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend getaway, far from the stress of our daily lives. The idea was simple: spend a few days disconnected from the world, enjoying nature, and unwinding. Little did we know that those few days would be anything but relaxing. The cabin itself was quaint and old, wooden structure with a stone fireplace and large windows that looked out onto the snow-covered forest. It was isolated, with the nearest town miles away, but that was exactly what we wanted. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just the five of us and the vast, quiet wilderness. The first day went by peacefully. We unpacked, explored the nearby trails, and spent the evening playing cards by the fire. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. It was calm, almost too calm, but we didn't think much of it at the time. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer or a fox, Perhaps, but the steps were too deliberate, too human. I sat up in bed, listening closely. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, crunching in the snow. They stopped just outside my window. My heart raced, and I held my breath, waiting for anything to happen. But after a long moment of silence, the footsteps continued around the cabin and eventually faded into the distance. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, maybe the wind playing tricks on me. I didn't want to alarm anyone, so I went back to sleep, though I kept one ear open for any more strange noises. The next morning, I didn't mention the footsteps to my friends. We spent the day hiking and enjoying the peaceful surroundings. The forest was beautiful, with tall pines and snow that seemed to absorb all sound. But despite the tranquility, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods felt too quiet, too still, like they were holding their breath. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, we gathered around the fireplace again. The cabin felt cozy, but there was an underlying tension in the air, something none of us could quite put our finger on. As the night wore on, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and causing the cabin to creak. We all laughed it off, joking about the classic horror movie setting, but deep down, I could see that the others were just as uneasy as I was. We eventually called it a night and retreated to our rooms. I tried to sleep, but every creak and groan of the cabin set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, slowly circling the cabin just like the night before. This time, they were heavier, more deliberate. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening as the steps came closer and closer to my window. I didn't dare look outside. The footsteps stopped again, right by my window, and I could hear faint breathing. Something, or someone, was standing just on the other side of the wall. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to the slow, measured breaths. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods once again. The next morning, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. Over breakfast, I asked if anyone else had heard the footsteps. To my surprise, Jake, one of my friends, admitted that he had heard them too, but like me, he had tried to ignore it. That's when Emily spoke up, her face pale. She said she'd seen something outside her window, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching the cabin. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the light-hearted atmosphere from the previous day gone. We decided to check the perimeter of the cabin, hoping to find tracks in the snow, something to explain what we had heard and seen. But when we stepped outside, there were no footprints. The snow was undisturbed, pristine, as if no one had been there at all. The rest of the day was tense. We stuck together, none of us wanting to be alone, but the sense of being watched never left. That night, the footsteps returned, circling the cabin once again. We all heard them this time, and we huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then, the doorknob rattled. We all froze, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. But it never did. The rattling stopped, and the footsteps slowly moved away, fading into the night once more. We left the cabin the next morning, cutting our trip short. None of us could explain what had happened, and we never spoke about it again. But I'll never forget those footsteps in the snow, the feeling of being watched, and the knowledge that something we couldn't see or understand was out there in the woods, watching us. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was meant to be a relaxing escape from our busy lives, but it turned into something far more unsettling. The cabin was nestled deep in the forest, far from the nearest neighbor, with only the rustling leaves and distant animal calls to keep us company. It was charming in a rustic way, with its wooden walls, creaky floors, and a fireplace that promised warmth against the crisp autumn air. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cabin. We spent the first evening settling in, enjoying a hearty meal and the warmth of the fire. The night was clear and cold, with the moonlight filtering through the tall trees. We joked and laughed, unaware of what the night had in store for us. As the evening wore on, we decided to play a board game to pass the time. The cabin's isolation meant we had no cell service or internet, which was actually a welcome change. Around midnight, we heard a faint noise, a scratching sound coming from the walls. We brushed it off as the house settling or perhaps an animal outside. A few hours later, we went to bed. I was the first to wake up around 3 a.m. I heard the scratching sound again, but this time it was louder, more persistent. I got up to investigate, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls near the bathroom. I shone my flashlight along the walls, trying to find the source of the noise. There was nothing visible, just old wood and insulation. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me feeling unsettled but not quite alarmed. I checked the windows and doors to make sure everything was secure and went back to bed. Around dawn, I was jolted awake by a loud thud from the attic. The noise was so jarring that it made my heart race. I shook my friends awake and suggested we check it out. We hesitated but eventually agreed. The attic was accessed by a narrow, rickety staircase that led up from a small closet. We climbed the stairs cautiously, the old wood creaking beneath our weight. The attic was dusty and filled with old furniture and boxes. There was nothing obviously out of place until we noticed an old trunk in the corner. It was locked, and the dust on it suggested it hadn't been touched in years. Should we open it? Jake asked, eyeing the trunk. No way, Sarah said. Let's just check the rest of the attic. We searched the attic thoroughly, but found nothing else unusual. The thudding sound had stopped, and the attic seemed just as old and dusty as before. We decided to leave the trunk alone and went back downstairs, where the noise had ceased. The rest of the day was uneventful. We hiked through the woods and enjoyed the fresh air. That night, we decided to have a campfire outside. As we sat around the fire, we talked about the strange noises from the previous night, each of us trying to rationalize what we had heard. Around midnight, the scratching sound returned. This time, it was unmistakable and came from the attic again. We were all on edge, our earlier bravado gone. We decided to pack up and leave early, our initial excitement replaced by a palpable sense of unease. We gathered our things and made one last check of the cabin. As we packed the car, we noticed something strange. The attic window, which had been closed tightly earlier, was now slightly open. None of us had touched it, and the cold wind that greeted us as we approached the car only heightened our apprehension. We left the cabin, our nerves frayed but our safety intact. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. We talked little about the experience, but the unsettling feeling remained. Later, I learned from the rental agency that the cabin had a history of strange occurrences. Previous guests had reported odd noises and unexplained events, but nothing ever seemed to be malicious. The scratching and thudding were just part of the cabin's eerie charm, a reminder that some places hold onto their secrets, no matter how much time passes. Even now, the memory of that weekend lingers. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest experiences are those that defy explanation, leaving us with only shadows and whispers in the night. A few years ago, my friends and I rented a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. The cabin was charming, nestled among tall pines with a clear view of a serene lake. The isolation was perfect for a break from our hectic lives. We arrived on a Friday evening, excited for a weekend of relaxation and adventure. The first night was peaceful. We cooked dinner, played games, and enjoyed the crackling fire in the fireplace. As night fell, we turned in early, eager for a full day of hiking and exploration the next day. The cabin had a quaint, rustic feel, and the only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves outside and the occasional hoot of an owl. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why, but something felt off. I listened intently, and after a few minutes, I heard a faint sound of rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere outside. It was strange and irregular, like something heavy was being dropped repeatedly. I tried to ignore it and went back to sleep, but the sound continued, growing louder. I decided to investigate, not wanting to alarm my friends. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly slipped out of my room, making my way to the living room. The thumping was more distinct now, coming from the direction of the lake. The cabin was dark, illuminated only by the weak beam of my flashlight. I checked the windows, but there was nothing unusual to see. The thumping persisted, and I decided to step outside to get a better look. The night was cold and damp. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I walked cautiously towards the lake, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The thumping seemed to be coming from the water's edge. When I reached the shore, the thumping stopped abruptly. The lake was perfectly still, its surface reflecting the moonlight like glass. I scanned the area, but saw nothing unusual, just the dark water and the dense forest surrounding it. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of the noise. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange, a figure standing among the trees, partially obscured by the shadows. My heart raced as I tried to make out the shape, but it remained indistinct, like a dark silhouette against the night. I took a deep breath and called out, "Hello. Is someone there?" My voice echoed off the lake and through the trees, but there was no response. The figure remained still, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the thumping started again, this time louder and more frantic. It was as if whatever was making the noise was getting closer. I turned and quickly headed back towards the cabin, my flashlight flickering as I hurried through the underbrush. Back inside, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal or some other natural explanation. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the night, but the thumping never returned. In the morning, I told my friends about the strange occurrence. They were skeptical but agreed that it was probably nothing to worry about. We spent the day hiking and exploring, trying to enjoy our trip despite the unsettling events of the previous night. Later that day, while we were hiking, I spoke to a local who mentioned that the area around the lake was known for strange noises at night. He said it was a common occurrence, often attributed to old machinery or something similar. I felt somewhat reassured but couldn't shake the feeling of unease. We spent the rest of the weekend without incident, though the memory of that night lingered. The cabin was charming, and the woods were beautiful, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched or the eerie thumping that seemed to come from nowhere. When we left on Sunday, I looked back at the cabin and the surrounding woods with a mix of relief and lingering curiosity. The experience reminded me that sometimes, even in the most peaceful settings, there are mysteries and sensations that defy easy explanations. It was a reminder that the woods and the unknown can hold secrets that we might never fully understand. It was a few years ago, in the middle of winter, when my friends and I decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. We were all eager for a break from city life and thought a cozy retreat would be perfect. The cabin, nestled deep in the forest, was the ideal escape, a charming wooden structure with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking snow-covered trees. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, with the roads clear and the snow sparkling under the afternoon sun. When we arrived, the cabin looked like something out of a fairy tale, surrounded by a pristine blanket of snow. We unpacked, made ourselves comfortable, and enjoyed a leisurely evening by the fire. That night, after a hearty dinner and a few rounds of board games, we decided to turn in early. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the gentle howling of the wind outside. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the warmth and the peacefulness of the surroundings. In the dead of night, I woke up to an unsettling sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like fingers drumming on the window. Groggy and confused, I looked around the dark room. My friends were still asleep, and the tapping continued, growing louder. I crept out of bed and tiptoed to the window, but saw nothing but the thick, impenetrable darkness of the forest. I tried to rationalize the noise as branches brushing against the window, but the tapping was persistent and seemed to deliberate. The cabin was remote, and it was hard to imagine anyone being out there at this hour. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come easily. The next morning, I mentioned the tapping to my friends, but they dismissed it as the wind or perhaps an animal. We spent the day exploring the snowy landscape, enjoying the crisp air and the serene beauty of the forest. By evening, the tapping had completely slipped my mind. That night, we decided to have another relaxing evening by the fire. We ate, drank, and chatted until late. As the night wore on, I felt an eerie sense of déjà vu. The tapping from the previous night started again, faint but unmistakable. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just the wind playing tricks. Around midnight, the tapping grew louder and more insistent. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I woke my friends, and we decided to investigate. We all grabbed flashlights and ventured outside into the freezing cold. The snow crunched under our boots as we circled the cabin, scanning the area with our flashlights. We checked all the windows and doors but found nothing unusual. The tapping seemed to come from the side of the cabin facing the woods. We shone our lights into the darkness but saw nothing beyond the trees. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of the wind. Maybe it's just a branch hitting the side of the cabin, Jake suggested. Though he didn't sound entirely convinced, we all agreed and headed back inside, our nerves on edge. The tapping stopped abruptly as we returned to the warmth of the cabin. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The next morning, we decided to cut our trip short and head back home. The tapping had left us all on edge, and we felt it was best to leave the cabin behind. As we packed up and prepared to leave, I noticed something peculiar. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed, with no footprints or signs of anyone having been near the walls. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin, now shrouded in a cold, gray mist. The tapping remained a mystery, and though we all made it out safely, the experience left us with a lingering sense of unease. We later learned that the cabin had been vacant for years before it was rented to us, and there were no recent reports of strange activity. The owner had mentioned that the cabin had a reputation for odd occurrences, but we hadn't taken it seriously. The tapping in the night remained unexplained. The cabin, though charming and beautiful, held onto a lingering mystery that made our brief stay unforgettable. It was a reminder that some places, no matter how picturesque, can harbor strange and unsettling secrets. A few months ago, I spent a weekend at a secluded cabin in the woods with a couple of friends. The cabin belonged to a family member who had recently offered it to us for a relaxing retreat. Nestled deep in the forest, it promised tranquility away from our hectic lives. What we experienced was anything but peaceful. We arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting. The cabin was charming, with rustic wooden walls and a stone fireplace. The surrounding woods were dense, and the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. After settling in, we lit a fire and enjoyed a meal, savoring the calm of the evening. As night fell, the temperature dropped significantly. We spent the evening playing board games and chatting, the crackling fire creating a cozy atmosphere. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I was the last to head to bed, turning off the lights and ensuring the cabin was locked up for the night. I had just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by a loud, sharp knock on the front door. My heart raced, and I lay still, trying to make sense of the noise. The knock came again, louder and more insistent. I glanced at my phone. It was 2:13 a.m. I hesitated, not wanting to alarm my friends or risk opening the door to someone who might be dangerous. I listened intently, but the knocking had stopped. Summoning my courage, I slowly got out of bed and crept to the living room. The knocking had ceased, but the door was still securely locked. I checked the windows and doors to ensure everything was in place. The eerie quiet of the cabin was unsettling, and the darkness outside seemed to close in on me. I didn't see anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Returning to bed, I tried to convince myself it was just a prank or some wildlife, though it seemed odd for animals to knock so deliberately. I managed to fall back asleep, but the knocking haunted my dreams. The next morning, I shared the experience with my friends, hoping they might offer a rational explanation. They were skeptical but agreed to stay vigilant. We spent the day hiking and exploring, trying to put the strange event behind us. As dusk approached, we returned to the cabin, feeling a mix of fatigue and relief. We cooked dinner and spent the evening by the fire, trying to enjoy the tranquility. As night fell, the sense of unease returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though nothing unusual happened. Around midnight, we were all in bed when the knocking started again. This time, it was accompanied by a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being dragged across the porch. I got up and checked the doors and windows once more, but everything seemed secure. The knocking grew louder and more frantic. I was too frightened to open the door but knew we needed to investigate. I gathered my friends, and we decided to check outside together. We stepped onto the porch, and the dragging sound stopped abruptly. The night was still, and the forest was silent except for the distant calls of owls. We scanned the area with flashlights but found nothing out of the ordinary. The knocking had stopped, and there were no signs of anyone or anything. We stayed outside for a while, hoping to catch whatever was causing the disturbance. After what felt like an eternity, we decided to go back inside. We locked up and kept the lights on, sitting around the fireplace, too anxious to sleep. The rest of the night passed without incident, and the morning light brought a sense of relief. We packed up and left the cabin, feeling a mix of dread and relief as we drove away. When we returned home, I did some research on the area and discovered that the cabin had a history of unexplained events and eerie occurrences. Previous visitors had reported similar disturbances, but no one ever found a logical explanation. To this day, the experience remains vivid in my memory. The knocking and dragging sounds, combined with the oppressive silence of the forest, created an atmosphere of genuine fear. We never found out what caused the noises, but the cabin in the woods remains a place of mystery and unease. Despite the unsettling events, we were fortunate that nothing more sinister came of it. Sometimes, it's better not to fully understand the things that go bump in the night.